My name is Hal Owens. I'm 58 years old, and I've lived my whole life in Hadley, Nebraska, never left it, not for more than a week at a stretch. Some men go out and see the world. I delivered it to my neighbors' mailboxes for 31 years and called that close enough. I was the mail carrier here, same route, near about, my whole career. I knew which houses got the good news and which ones dreaded the mailbox. I knew everybody in this town, and everybody knew me, and there's a comfort in that, and a loneliness in it too, that I never could explain to anybody who didn't live it. My wife was Marge. We were married 29 years. She passed 4 winters ago, cancer, the slow and merciless kind, and I sat with her through every day of it. She was a good woman, and we had a good life, even if it was a quiet one, even if there was a corner of each of us the other never quite reached. After she was gone, the house went so still I took to leaving the television on just for the sound of human voices. So that's me, an old mail carrier in a small town, rattling around an empty house, who figured the interesting part of his life was behind him and the rest was just the long walk home. Then the letter came, a real letter, in an envelope, which by my trade I can tell you is a rare and precious thing these days. Hadley High School. The class of 1985, our 40th reunion, that coming Saturday night at the old high school gym. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I held that invitation for 2 weeks and I came up with 40 reasons to stay home. Who wants to stand around a gym at 58 years old, alone, with a name tag on his chest, explaining to people he barely remembers that yes, he's still in Hadley, and no, there's no Mrs. Owens anymore? It sounded like a special kind of misery, but Marge's voice was in my head. She always said I hid from my own life. So that Saturday, I put on my good shirt and I drove down to the gym alone, fully intending to leave early. I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea that I was about to find the thing I'd been missing for 40 years and that she'd been standing in plain sight the whole time. The gym hadn't changed. That was the first thing that got me. 40 years, and it still smelled like floor wax and old sneakers and decades of teenage nerves. They'd strung up some lights and set out folding tables and hired a fellow to play records, and there was a table by the door with name tags, each one printed with your senior yearbook photo so nobody had to suffer the shame of not recognizing a soul. I found mine. There was that boy, 18 years old, with a head of hair and a whole life he didn't know anything about. I pinned him to my chest and walked into my own past. It's a strange thing, a reunion, when you get to be our age. The faces come at you doubled. There's the gray, soft, settled person in front of you, and there's the 17-year-old you knew, flickering underneath. And your mind keeps trying to lay one over the other. Half the night is just people staring at each other's name tags and then gasping, "No, no, it can't be." I made my rounds. There was Denny Fisk, who'd been the terror of the football field, leaning on a cane now and showing everybody pictures of his grandkids. There was the Lindquist twins, who you still couldn't tell apart. There was a whole table of folks I'd delivered mail to for 30 years, who looked at me like they'd never connected the man in the postal uniform with the boy in the yearbook. I shook a lot of hands. I said you look great a lot of times, some of them even true, and the whole while, underneath the noise, I'll confess to you the real reason I'd come. Underneath all the dread, there was one name I was hoping to see, Sherry Vaughn. If a story like this is stirring something in you tonight, do an old man a kindness and tap that like button. And subscribe if you'd care to, because I tell one of these every week and I suspect you and I are cut from the same lonely cloth. There's a question I mean to ask you near the end, and I truly want to hear your answer. Now let me tell you about Sherry Vaughn and about the girl I never once thought to look at. Sherry Vaughn was the prettiest girl in the class of 1985, and she knew it, and so did every boy with a pulse. Homecoming queen. Hair like something off a shampoo bottle. I spent the better part of 3 years half in love with the idea of her, the way a boy loves a thing he knows he can't have. I never had the nerve to do much about it, but Moon. She was kind enough to me, in the careless way pretty girls are kind to boys who aren't in the running. And at our senior prom, she let me have one dance, one near the end of the night. And I lived on that one dance for about a decade. I built that girl up in my mind for 40 years. She became a kind of measuring stick for everything I thought I wanted and never got. So when I walked into that gym, some foolish 18-year-old still alive inside me was looking for Sherry Vaughn. I found her too, over by the punch table, holding court the way she always did. And I'll tell you, time is gentle to some, and Sherry was one of them. Still handsome, still bright. I worked up my nerve and went and said hello. And friend, the strangest thing happened. Nothing, absolutely nothing happened in my chest. She was perfectly pleasant. She told me about her place in Scottsdale and her third husband and her cosmetic line, and her eyes drifted over my shoulder the whole time looking for somebody more interesting, and I stood there waiting for the old lightning to strike, and it just never came. The girl I'd built a shrine to for 40 years was a stranger I had nothing to say to. The fantasy had been the realest thing about her, and I'd dreamed it all up myself. I felt like a fool. I drifted away from the punch table, feeling about as low as a man can feel, because if Sherry Vaughn was nothing, then what had I been carrying around all these years? An empty box with a pretty label. And that's when I ended up at a corner table, by myself, near the far wall of that gym. The same far wall I'd realized later where the kids who didn't get asked to dance used to stand at the prom. The wallflower corner. Funny how a body finds its old spot. There was a woman already sitting there. Alone, like me, reading her own name tag situation, I suppose. She had a kind face, soft gray hair, a quiet sort of way about her. I looked at her name tag, Faye Dwyer, and I'm ashamed to tell you, it took me a long moment. Faye Dwyer. The name came back slow, like something from the bottom of a drawer. A quiet girl, smart, I thought, always around the edges of things. I could not, standing there, recall one single conversation I'd ever had with her in 4 years of high school. Hal Owens, she said, and she smiled, and there was something in that smile, something warm and a little sad, that I didn't understand yet. You probably don't remember me. Faye, I said. Of course I do. A small lie, the kind you tell to be kind. No, you don't, she said gently, but that's all right. You weren't supposed to. I didn't know what to make of that, so I sat down, and we started to talk. And I want to tell you, I have not talked to anyone like that in 40 years. Maybe ever. Faye Dwyer had left Hadley the week after graduation and never really come back, not till now. She'd gone to Omaha, then Denver, put herself through nursing school working nights, and spent 35 years as a labor and delivery nurse, catching other people's babies in the small hours of the morning. She'd married a good man named Walt, who drove long haul, and they'd never been able to have children of their own, and she'd made her peace with that by mothering half of Denver's newborns instead. Walt passed 6 years ago. She'd come back to this reunion, she said, on a whim she couldn't quite explain, just to see the town one more time, just to close a circle. We talked through the whole evening. We never moved from that corner table. The record player played the songs we'd been young to, and the crowd thinned out around us, and neither of us noticed, because somewhere in that conversation, I'd started to feel something I hadn't felt since I was a young man. I felt seen. This quiet woman I couldn't remember was looking at me like I was worth looking at, and asking me questions like my answers mattered, and laughing at my dumb jokes like they were the funniest things she'd heard in years. She remembered things about our school years I'd long forgotten. She remembered the teachers' little ways, the cruel and the kind ones. She remembered the winter the heat broke, and we all sat in our coats through algebra. And once or twice she remembered something about me, some small thing, where I'd sat in a certain class, how I used to whistle coming down the hall, and I'd think, how on earth does she remember that, when I can't remember her at all? I didn't understand it yet, but the more we talked, the more I had the strangest feeling, like she knew me, not knew of me, knew me, down deep, in a way that 31 years of neighbors and 29 years of marriage never quite had. You stayed, she said at one point, soft, like it meant something. All these years, you stayed right here. Never had a reason to leave, I said, or never had the nerve. I'm not always sure which. She looked at me a long moment. I had to leave, she said. I couldn't have stayed in this town. There was too much here I couldn't have any more. And she looked down at her coffee, and I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't ask, and Lord, I wish now I'd asked sooner. Late in the night, the band, or the record fellow, put on a slow one, and the few couples left swayed out under the lights, and I got to talking about the old days.
And I don't know what made me say it, except that Faye Dwyer was so easy to say things to. You know, I said, I almost didn't graduate with this class. People don't know that. My dad died our senior spring. Heart attack out of nowhere, dropped right there in the driveway on a Tuesday, and I was the one who found him. He was a hard man, and we hadn't been close.
But a boy doesn't get over finding his father like that, and it turned out he'd left us nothing but bills, mortgaged everything. My mother was beside herself, working double shifts at the cannery just to keep the lights on. And there I was, 2 months from graduation, the first Owens who'd ever have finished high school, and we couldn't scrape together the money for the fees, the cap and gown, the diploma fee, all of it. Wasn't but $30-some, but it may as well have been $30,000. I was going to skip my own graduation. I'd made up my mind, and I hadn't even told my mother, because I couldn't stand to see her face when I did. Too proud to take charity, too broke to walk. Faye had gone very still across the table. And then a strange thing happened, I said. Mrs. Pratt called me into the office one day, and she told me it was all taken care of, every dime. She said an anonymous donor had covered it, a classmate's family, she said, who wanted to stay private, and I walked at that graduation, after all. Got my diploma. My mother cried in the third row. I shook my head. 40 years, Faye, and I never found out who it was. I've wondered my whole life, some guardian angel in the class of '85 who didn't want me to miss my own graduation. I'd give anything to know who to thank. I looked up, and Faye Dwyer's eyes were full, and she was looking at me, and she wasn't saying anything at all, and the whole gym went quiet in my ears, because I knew. God as my witness, I just knew. Faye, I whispered, it was you. She looked down at her hands, and then, so soft I almost missed it, she said, I had a job at the Rexall after school. I'd been saving for a winter coat. She gave a little laugh, and a tear slipped down. I'd saved up almost $40. It was a fortune to me. And I heard you were going to miss graduation, and I couldn't stand it, Hal. I couldn't stand the thought of you not walking. So I took my coat money down to the office, and I gave it to Mrs. Pratt, and I made her swear on her life she'd never tell. And she never did. I could not speak. 40 years. Why? I finally got out. Faye, why would you do that? You barely knew me. I can't remember ever once being kind to you. And Faye Dwyer looked up at me then, and she laid it down. All of it. 40 years of it. Gentle as anything. Because I was in love with you, Hal, she said. All through high school. Hopeless. Head over heels. The way you only can be at 17. You never knew. You were never supposed to know. You only had eyes for Sherry Vaughn. And I was the quiet girl in the corner. And I made my peace with that a long time ago. But I couldn't watch you miss your graduation. I'd have sold more than a coat to keep that from happening. Loving somebody doesn't always mean they ever find out. Sometimes it just means you do quiet things, and you never tell, and you go on and live your life. That's a kind of love, too. It's the kind I had. It's the only kind I ever got to give you. She wiped her eyes and gave a small, watery laugh. I went home that night and cried, if you want to know. Not because I was sad. Because for one afternoon I'd gotten to do something for the boy I loved, and he'd never know it was me. And somehow that was the closest I ever thought I'd get to loving you out loud. I made it last 40 years. The record was still playing, that slow song. And I thought about 40 years. I thought about that boy mooning over Sherry Vaughn, building a shrine to a girl who never once truly saw him, while not 10 feet away, in the corner of every room, stood a girl who loved him enough to give up her winter coat so he could walk at his own graduation, and never asked for one thing back. Not even to be remembered. I had spent my whole life looking at the wrong place in the room. I stood up. My old knees protested, but I stood up, and I held out my hand to Faye Dwyer, there in the wallflower corner of that gym, 40 years too late. Faye, I said, and my voice was shaking. Would you dance with me? She put her hand in mine, and I led her out, and we danced. Two gray-haired people in an emptying gym, slow, the way we never got to at 17. And I held her, and she fit there like she'd always been meant to, and I felt 40 years of being half alive just fall away. I stood right over there, she said, against my shoulder, at the senior prom. Right against that wall. I watched you dance with Sherry Vaughn for 3 minutes, and I thought my heart would break clean in half. She pulled back and looked up at me, and she was smiling through the tears. 40 years I carried that picture, and here you are, dancing with me in the very same corner. Isn't that the strangest thing, Hal? I had to wait 40 years, but you finally crossed the room. I didn't have any words, so I just held her tighter, and we kept dancing long after the song was over, because neither of us was about to be the one to stop. Before I tell you the rest, let me stop here a moment, because I expect some of you are feeling this one in a tender place. If this story is reaching you tonight, please tap subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from. And here's what I really want to know, the thing I've been turning over ever since that night. Was there ever a Faye in your life? Somebody who loved you quietly, who you never noticed, or somebody you loved that same quiet way and never told? I'd give a great deal to hear about it. I'll be reading every single one. Now let me tell you how it went after that gym. We closed the place down. The record fellow had to pack up around us. We were the last two there, an old mail carrier and a retired baby nurse, standing in the parking lot under the one working light. Neither one of us wanting the night to end. Can I tell you something foolish? She said. I almost didn't come tonight. I had the ticket for a month, and I changed my mind a dozen times. A woman my age, driving 500 miles back to a town she left 40 years ago, to a reunion alone, it seemed pitiful, even to me. She looked up at the light. But I'll tell you the truth, since we're done with anything but the truth. You and me. Some part of me hoped you'd be here. The boy from the corner of my heart. I told myself I just wanted to see the town. But I packed my good dress, Hal. A woman doesn't pack her good dress to see a town. I almost didn't come either, I said. I held that invitation 2 weeks looking for a way out of it. She laughed, soft. Then we very nearly missed each other twice. Once at 17 and once at 58. She shook her head. I don't think I'd have survived missing you a second time. I'm only in town 3 more days, she said then. I've got a flight back to Denver on Wednesday. And the old Hal, the one who'd hidden from his own life for 58 years, the one Marge always scolded. That Hal would have said something polite and let her drive off into the dark and spent the rest of his days wondering. I felt him rise up in me, ready to do the safe and sorry thing, and I told him to sit down and be quiet. Then I've got 3 days to make up for 40 years, I said. Have breakfast with me tomorrow, Faye, and lunch, and supper. Let an old fool buy you every meal in Hadley and try to figure out how he managed to be blind for 4 decades. She laughed, and she cried a little, and she said yes. I did not let go of her hand in that parking lot. I want you to understand that. I had walked into that gym alone, the way I'd walked into everything my whole life. And I walked out holding Faye Dwyer's hand, and I have done my level best not to let go of it since. Those 3 days were the best 3 days I'd had in longer than I could reckon. The next morning I took her to breakfast at the diner on Main, and old Verna, who runs the place, looked at me sitting across from a woman with my whole face lit up, and she didn't say a thing. Just poured the coffee and grinned at me like the cat that got the cream. After, I drove Faye out on my old mail route. The whole thing, every road. I showed her the Henderson's place where the dog used to chase me for 15 years and then went deaf, and we made our peace. I showed her the bridge where I'd sit and eat my lunch in good weather. I showed her my whole small life, 31 years of one town, and I kept waiting to feel ashamed of how little it added up to, the way I always had. And I never did, because Faye looked at all of it like it was something worth seeing. She said a man who knew one town that well, who'd carried its mail and its news and its troubles for 30 years, had not lived a small life at all. She said he'd lived a deep one. I had to pull the truck over a minute when she said that. 40 years, and nobody had ever made my life sound like that. That night we drove out to the reservoir and sat on the tailgate and watched the dark come down, and she told me about Walt and the babies she'd caught and the children she'd wanted and never had. And I told her about Marge and the long bad year at the end and the still house after. We weren't young and we weren't pretending. We laid our losses out on that tailgate side by side, and somehow 2 piles of grief sitting next to each other felt lighter than either one alone. Those 3 days turned into a week. The week turned into me driving out to Denver a month later. Then her driving back. We were too old to play it cool and too aware of the clock to waste a minute pretending. At our age, you don't have time for games. You know exactly what you've found, and you know exactly what it cost you to find it, and you hold on with both hands. I think about Marge, and I want to say this plain, because I won't have anyone misunderstand it. I loved my wife. She was good to me for 29 years, and I'd not trade them. But I think Marge always knew there was a part of me that had never been truly reached, and I think wherever she is, she's not sorry to see it reached at last. A good soul wants the people it leaves behind to be more alive, not less. I believe that. And I think about Faye, 17 years old, carrying her coat money down to that office in secret, loving a boy who couldn't see past a homecoming queen, asking for nothing, carrying it quiet for 40 years. There's a kind of love that struts around, and a kind that just quietly pays your way and never signs its name, and I am here to tell you which one wears better over a lifetime. Faye and I are getting married this spring, right here in Hadley, in the same town I never left and she couldn't wait to leave, which we both think is the funniest thing in the world. She's selling the place in Denver and moving back. Says she's spent 40 years catching other folks' babies, and she's ready to come home and just be still a while. With me. We're going to have the reception in the gym. The same gym. I asked her where she wanted it, and she said that Wallflower Corner finally owes her a good night. And I laughed till I about cried. I'll leave you with this, friend. I spent 40 years believing the best thing I ever almost had was a pretty girl who gave me one dance out of pity. I built my whole sense of what I'd missed around her. And the truth was sitting at a corner table the whole time, in a quiet woman whose name I could barely remember, who had loved me when I was a poor, grieving, invisible boy, and had proved it in the realest way there is, and had never once asked me to know. I went to that reunion alone. I almost didn't go at all. I came within a hair of staying home in that still house with the television on for company, and missing her by the width of one Saturday night. 40 years we'd circled each other, and it came down to whether one tired old man could make himself put on a clean shirt and walk into a gym. I never expected it. Not at 58. I thought the interesting part of my life was behind me. So if you're out there tonight thinking your story's mostly written, that the good chapters are spent, hear an old mail carrier out. You do not know who is sitting at the corner table. You do not know who loved you quietly 40 years ago, or who might, if you only get up out of your chair and go. It is so much later than we'd like, but it is not, I promise you, too late. Go to the reunion. Go to the thing you're dreading. Get up out of the still house. You might just walk out holding her hand. This is Hal Owens from Hadley, Nebraska, who learned the most important thing of his life at 58 years old in the corner of a gym that smelled like floor wax. Good night, and don't you dare give up.